A house, 8 victims, and a killer who vanished without a trace. This brutal axe murder has remained unsolved for 112 years. But what really happened in that house on the night of the massacre? Are you ready to uncover the dark truth behind the Villisca Axe Murders? In the summer of 1912, Villisca, Iowa was a tight-knit, peaceful town where no one bothered to lock their doors at night. The Moore family, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, were well-liked residents. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the Moores spent the evening at a church event, the Children's Day program, which Sarah had helped organize. Accompanying them were 2 young friends of the Moore children, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister Ina, who had been invited for a sleepover that night. After the program ended at about 9:30 p.m., the family and the Stillinger girls walked home, arriving at the Moore house sometime before 10 p.m. It was a night like any other. Children yawning after a long day of play and prayer, parents tucking them into bed, utterly ordinary and innocent. Little did Villisca know that this ordinary evening was about to descend into unfathomable horror. Under a starry sky, the white frame house at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca stands silent. Inside, 8 souls lie asleep, unaware of the doom creeping ever closer. In the dead of night, sometime after midnight on June 10th, 1912, a shadow slipped silently through the Moore house. The doors had been left unlocked. Crime was the last thing on anyone's mind in this small town. It's believed the killer may have been hiding in the attic, waiting for the household to fall asleep. Indeed, investigators later found 2 spent cigarettes in the attic, suggesting someone lurked there in the dark while the family slumbered. In one hand, the intruder carried Josiah Moore's own axe, stolen from the yard. In the other, an oil lamp with the wick turned low, casting only the faintest glimmer as the figure moved from room to room. The carnage began in the master bedroom. The killer crept to where Josiah and Sarah Moore lay and raised the axe high above the sleeping couple. The first blow descended on Josiah's skull with such force that it gouged the ceiling. Josiah likely died instantly, his face later found so battered that his eyes were missing. Sarah had barely a moment to wake. She too was struck and killed before she could scream. One by one, the assailant stalked through the house. Next, he entered the children's room and bludgeoned Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and little Paul as they slept. Not a sound was heard from the children. Mercifully, it appears none woke before the axe fell. Finally, the killer went downstairs to the guest bedroom, where Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. Lena, the older girl, may have been the only one to wake up in those final moments. She was found lying crosswise on the bed with a defensive wound on her arm, indicating she tried to fight back. It was no use. The murderer swung the axe and ended both young girls' lives, completing an act of pure savagery. In all, 8 victims, including 6 children, were brutally slain with an axe. As the dust settled, the murderer wasn't finished at the scene. In a grotesque display, the killer went back through the house, inflicting additional blows on the victims' bodies even after they were dead. Josiah alone was struck in the head around 30 times. The intruder then carefully covered the faces of the dead with bedclothes and clothing. Shirts or dresses were draped over their shattered heads, as if to mask the horrific sight. In eerie silence, the killer performed a bizarre ritual throughout the home. They hung cloths over every mirror and reflective surface, veiling the house in darkness. In the kitchen, a 4-pound slab of bacon was removed from the icebox and left on the floor, wrapped in a dish towel. A pan of half-eaten food sat on the table, and a bowl full of bloody water suggested the murderer had washed their hands before departing. The scene was chaotic and deeply disturbing. Bed sheets covered windows and mirrors, bloody water in a basin, food scattered on the floor, and that odd piece of bacon left beside the axe. Having completed this unsettling tableau, the killer quietly slipped away into the night, leaving behind a house of horrors. Monday morning, June 10, 1912, dawned with an uneasy calm. As the sun rose, neighbor Mary Peckham noticed something was amiss at the Moore residence. Usually by early morning, the Moore household would be up and about doing chores, but on this day, no one emerged to tend to the chickens or start the stove. Concerned, Peckham went over at around 7 a.m. and knocked on the door. No answer. The house was eerily quiet and locked from the inside. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out to ensure they were fed, then called Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. When Ross arrived, he used his spare key to unlock the front door, while a nervous Mary Peckham waited on the porch. Ross stepped into the silent parlor and opened the door to the first downstairs bedroom. What he saw made him stagger back in horror. On the bed lay the bloodied bodies of Lena and Ina Stillinger. Ross immediately shouted for Mary to fetch Villisca's marshal, Henry Hank Horton. Horton arrived to a ghastly scene. Searching the house with Ross at his heels, the marshal found that everyone inside was dead. In each bedroom, under blood-soaked sheets, were the lifeless bodies of the Moore family and the two Stillinger girls. All 8 victims had been bludgeoned to death with the axe, which was left in the guest room near the slain sisters. Hardened as he was, Marshal Horton could barely maintain his composure at the sight of such carnage. The entire community's worst nightmare had just become reality. By 8 a.m., word of the massacre began to spread, and soon Villisca descended into panic. Doctors who examined the bodies estimated the murders happened in the early morning hours, sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. The brutal efficiency of the killings, all carried out while the victims slept, made it clear that the perpetrator, or perpetrators, had planned the ambush carefully and struck with lightning speed. Townspeople realized with dread that a mass murderer had walked among them in the night and vanished without a trace. Shock gave way to frenzy as law enforcement and townsfolk tried to make sense of the atrocity. In 1912, Villisca had no police force equipped for a crime of this magnitude. Only the local marshal and a few county officials. News spread like wildfire, and in a tragic lapse of judgment, the crime scene was not secured in those first hours. As Horton and the doctor finished their initial survey, curious neighbors and townspeople poured into the Moore house to glimpse the nightmare for themselves. It's said that up to 100 people tromped through the blood-spattered rooms before authorities could intervene. In the chaos, crucial evidence was trampled or taken. Later reports claimed that souvenir hunters even pocketed pieces of the skulls or fragments of the murder weapon as grisly mementos. The once orderly white house at the edge of town became a madhouse of gawkers and grief-stricken neighbors, further contaminating what was left of the physical evidence. This unfortunate spectacle would grievously hamper the investigation. When the dust settled, investigators from neighboring counties and even the state arrived, determined to catch the monster responsible. Bloodhounds were brought in, posses were formed to search the surrounding countryside. Law enforcement interviewed anyone they could find who might know something. The coroner convened an inquest on June 11th, the very next day, and witnesses were questioned. Over time, multiple suspects emerged, but the evidence was scarce and circumstantial at best. The sheer brutality of the crime, combined with the bungled crime scene, made it a daunting puzzle for even seasoned detectives. Leads were followed for years, and several suspects would be scrutinized and even put on trial, yet the case remained stubbornly unsolved. The only certainty was the fear that hung over Villisca. Residents began locking their doors at night for the first time, and the image of a neighbor or stranger with an axe lingered in every anxious mind. With little to go on beyond the carnage in the house, the investigation spiraled into a web of theories and accusations. Despite extensive investigations, no killer was ever positively identified. Over the years, suspicion fell on a number of individuals, each theory as tangled and dark as the crime itself. Among the key suspects were Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca resident and Iowa State Senator. Jones had a personal connection to the victims. Josiah Moore had worked as a top salesman for Frank Jones's farm equipment business until leaving to open his own competing store. There were rumors of bad blood. Josiah's departure took lucrative business away from Jones, including a prized John Deere franchise. Town gossip even whispered that Josiah had an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, though no evidence ever proved this. Some in Villisca suspected that this local rivalry festered into murderous revenge. However, no direct evidence linking Senator Jones to the crime was ever found, and he steadfastly denied involvement. Reverend George Kelly, perhaps the most infamous suspect, Kelly was an English-born traveling preacher who happened to be in Villisca on the night of the murders. Eccentric and unstable, he had a reputation for odd behavior, peeping into windows and asking young women to pose nude for him. Reverend Kelly was in town to attend the same Children's Day church event the Moore family participated in, and he left Villisca by train early on the morning after the murders. In the weeks following, Kelly became obsessively interested in the case. He wrote rambling letters to police and the victims' families, claiming to have heard sounds or even witnessed the murders from afar. His unsettling fixation and intimate knowledge of the crime drew investigators' attention. In 1917, Kelly confessed to the Axe Murders, saying God had whispered to him to "suffer the children to come unto me," a chilling statement that sounded like a motive in his unhinged mind. However, the validity of his confession was dubious. It came after hours of interrogation, and Kelly soon recanted. He was put on trial twice for the Villisca murders, making him the only person ever formally charged. The first trial ended with a hung jury, and the second trial acquitted him. With no physical evidence tying him to the scene, Reverend Kelly walked free, his name forever etched into the legend of the crime. William Blackie Mansfield. Another theory posited that the murders were the work of a serial axe killer, and that Senator Jones might have even hired this individual to eliminate the Moore family in a professional hit. William Mansfield, a transient ex-con also known as Insane Blackie, became the prime suspect of a private detective named James Wilkerson in 1916. Wilkerson, working for the Burns Detective Agency, noticed striking similarities between the Villisca murders and a string of other axe slayings across the country. Just 9 months before Villisca, a family in Colorado Springs was murdered in their beds with an axe. Windows were covered with sheets, and lamps left burning without chimneys, details uncannily similar to Villisca. Other unsolved axe murders in Kansas around that time also seemed to fit the pattern. Wilkerson was convinced these crimes were related and that Mansfield was the axe-wielding culprit. He pointed out that in each case, the killer appeared to avoid leaving fingerprints by wearing gloves, suggesting a calculating perpetrator. In fact, Mansfield had an alleged criminal record with fingerprints on file, which Wilkerson thought explained the killer's caution. Acting on this theory, a grand jury was convened, and Mansfield was actually arrested and brought to Iowa to face investigation. However, Mansfield had a solid alibi. Payroll records showed he was working several states away at the time of the Villisca murders. After lengthy scrutiny, Mansfield was released due to lack of evidence. He even successfully sued Wilkerson for slander, winning a settlement for the false accusation. Mansfield's arrest only deepened the mystery. If he wasn't the Axe Man, who was? Other potential killers. The horror in Villisca did not occur in isolation. Remarkably similar crimes were cropping up in the Midwest in the early 1910s, raising suspicions that a roving serial killer might have been responsible. One suspect, Henry Lee Moore, no relation to Josiah Moore's family, was a man convicted of murdering his own mother and grandmother with an axe just months after the Villisca killings. Authorities noted that the way Henry Lee Moore killed his family bore eerie resemblances to the Villisca case and other unsolved axe murders, fueling speculation that he, or someone like him, could have been the Villisca perpetrator. More recently, modern crime researchers have suggested an even broader theory. In a 2017 book, investigators Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James argued that a single serial killer named Paul Meller may have been responsible for dozens of axe murders across the country, including the slaughter in Villisca. This hypothetical killer was said to ride the rails, picking homes near train tracks, and executing entire families in the dead of night before hopping back on a train to the next town. The Villisca house sits not far from railroad tracks, a detail that gives weight to this theory. While intriguing, these serial killer theories remain unproven. They underscore one haunting fact. Someone capable of butchering 8 people in one night might have struck before and could strike again. Each suspect in the Villisca case came with tantalizing clues and troubling questions, but no suspect could be definitively tied to the crime. This cloud of suspicion only deepened the town's trauma as neighbors eyed each other warily and countless lives were upended by accusation and rumor. In the aftermath of the Villisca Axe murders, the little town was never the same. Families double-checked their locks, children were kept close at night, and an unspoken dread lingered on every doorstep. Officially, the case went cold. Despite a lengthy investigation and even trials, no one was ever convicted for the murders. The Villisca Axe murders became one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in American history, leaving behind a legacy of intrigue and fear. Why did the killer choose the Moore family? Was it personal vengeance, an act of madness, or part of a serial killer's rampage? Over a century later, these questions still hang in the air, unanswered. The house on 2nd Street still stands to this day, preserved as a macabre museum piece, dubbed the Villisca Axe Murder House. In the years since 1912, it has attracted ghost hunters, historians, and curiosity seekers from around the country, all drawn by the echo of that night's terror. Locals will tell you the story as if it happened yesterday, how a beloved family went to church on a pleasant Sunday, then were brutally slain in their beds before Monday's dawn. The tale has become the stuff of local legend and lurid folklore, passed down through generations. True crime enthusiasts continue to pore over the details, hoping to find the missing piece of the puzzle. But the fact remains, someone got away with murdering 8 people, and their identity evaporated into the dark of night. More than 112 years have passed since that dreadful summer night, and Villisca's most infamous crime remains unsolved. The case endures as a chilling mystery, a reminder of how quickly innocence can be shattered. The Moore family and the Stillinger girls never got justice, but their story survives as a cautionary tale that still haunts and captivates all who hear it. As you close this chapter, you can't help but wonder if somewhere out there, hidden in an old diary or a dusty attic trunk, lies a clue that could finally put a name to the phantom with the axe. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video. Stay tuned for more true crime mysteries as we continue to unravel the darkest chapters of history.